Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Alexis, but I'm not alone.
No, you're not. Who else is with you?
That would be my dad. That's Dawn. And we are coming to you for the second installment in our series on weather, and more specifically hurricanes. We'll get into that here in the month of June here on the podcast.
And so we're looking at how hurricanes have impacted weather in general, but more specifically, events that have been identified most likely as hurricanes have impacted history. If you were here for episode 1, you'll recall, where were we, Lex?
We were in England.
Oh, imagine that. We went to, Alexis is here and we went to England.
Surprise. Who's shocked?
Who's
Nobody.
shocked? Nobody is. Those that are shocked, total 0 if you're accustomed at all listening to the podcast. Actually, I was mentioning as we were closing out the last episode, the fact that we get our comments there on Facebook. I think Alexis mentioned, or maybe teased, one of her episodes for whatever reason about what she was working on in a post, and indicated, and someone who obviously is a listener to the show said, well, I guess I know where we're going.
Yeah, all I said was I was recording, and they were like, oh, well, I think I know where we're going.
Yeah, I actually smiled a little bit when I saw that because it realized it may be a small audience, but it is a knowledgeable audience.
It's a dedicated audience,
Yeah.
which we appreciate.
We do. So, in our last episode 1 of this 4-part series, where were we, Lex? We said?
We were in England, and we were discussing the Spanish Armada of 1588.
And the impact of the Protestant wind, most likely a hurricane that disrupted Spanish plans for that little exercise.
If it was, let's call it Windy. Windy's a name. Windy's a girl name, since we name hurricanes now.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, there you go. So, actually, I went to school with someone whose name is Windy. And spelled with a W-I, so even better so. So we were in 1588, and we said we teased. You decided to tease them. I didn't. I was willing to tell everything. I'm on the record for that now. You decided we would only tease our listeners with what the next topic was going to be. Well, now we're at that episode. So we said we're jumping in our little magical time machine, and we're going...
We went a few centuries ahead from 1588.
So where are we landing?
We are landing in 1814.
Okay, so we're in 1814. We've advanced a couple of centuries, and where are we landing?
We are on the eastern seaboard of the United States.
All right, so you might have guessed 1814. That sounds like it's pretty close to 1812. There's this thing we call the War of
1812
that's going on. Alexis teased that England is going to be involved. The United States is at war with...
Great Britain.
Yeah, it is true. It is Great Britain by now. So, some have argued that in some ways the War of 1812 is like an extension of the American Revolution, or it's like a second war of honor, but it's the second conflict within a 40-ish year span between what is now the United States and Great Britain. And what are some of your favorite things about that war, Lex?
Yeah, I was telling my dad off podcast. So I should mention, this is like the war in American history when you learn it in school that kind of gets jumped over. You learn about the American Revolution and you learn about the Civil War, and the War of 1812 kind of gets mentioned, but kind of gets passed over. I think it's because it's kind of the American Revolution Part 2 scenario, so we don't put as much of emphasis on it, but I do have a couple kind of anecdotal stories that are my favorite. One is I've mentioned my dog Madison on the show before, and she actually gets her name from an event that's actually really close to what we're talking about today. She is named after Dolly Madison, the first lady in the time of the war, and Dolly Madison, the Madisons get word that the British are coming to burn Washington, D.C., and there is a life-size portrait of George Washington in the presidential mansion at the time. It's not called the White House during the time of the War of 1812. The presidential mansion, and basically Dolly Madison is trying to flee, and they're, her servants are asking, what can you help me with? And she points to this portrait and she says, you get that out of here. Either you destroy it or you make it safe, but the British can't have it. And it is still in the White House to this day. It was able to be saved based on Dolly Madison's efforts. So that's one of my favorite stories. My other favorite story is there's a house in Washington, D.C. that was occupied at the outset of the War of 1812 by the French ambassador who was friends with the owners of the house. And he actually sent word to the British general who was burning Washington at the time, saying, you can't burn this house. It is French territory. And the British general said, okay, I won't burn it. It's France. And so it actually survived the war. So I do like a lot of the anecdotal things that happened around the War of 1812, although I'm not as familiar with the actual history of the War of 1812.
Right. And the War of 1812, I agree with Alexis, at least in terms of the way that most of us learned our American history in the broad sense, particularly if you just had what you had in your high school, what maybe you had in college. It's not one of the wars that tends to be more focused upon. Not that it's ignored, it's important, but it's not one of the ones that we tend to spend a lot more time even discussing the military history of. Other key events that happened during the War of 1812, the United States National Anthem, which is the tune that we know as the Star Spangled Banner, which is actually a poem that somebody said a drinking tune to.
That's why it's really hard to
yeah,
sing.
but the poem was penned by Francis Scott Key while he is being held as a prisoner on a boat in Baltimore Harbor, seeing a very large American flag. That's actually during the War of 1812 that these events happened. So an important thing to mention there. And it is unique in that, remember, the capital of the United States during the American Revolution is not Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, the D.C. part of District of Columbia, is part of what is the settlement that basically becomes part of the Constitution about where the capital will be situated eventually, is this territory that was ceded that was not in any one state, that was neutral. And so Washington, D.C. a city had sort of existed there, but what we know of as being Washington, D.C. was an artificial creation for the still young nation. And so, as you mentioned, there is this place that we call the White House today that was the presidential mansion, and the United States Capitol been built, and the city been laid out by the architects and the planners for the city. But it's a very young Washington, D.C. that's the capital now. And during the War of 1812, nearby Baltimore is the much larger city. And in fact, British forces were housed primarily, they occupied and housed themselves in Baltimore. Baltimore was the larger strategic, from an economic standpoint, place to occupy during the war. But eventually there is a move made to move up and actually capture, take, and destroy, to burn the city of Washington, which is the capital. In most wars, the loss of your capital is sort of a
big deal.
A big deal. It's a big thing. If you think back to a lot of wars throughout history, the fall of the capital, the sacking of a city, when does the Roman Empire end? Well, when Rome falls. Because your capital has fallen. And so it's obviously a very important thing when your capital city, in this case Washington, is going to fall or be part of what's there. Although you might argue, again, because it was not the long-standing, centuries-old capital, it's symbolic, it's important, but it's more symbolic than actual. It wasn't the city of New York. It wasn't a major city like Boston or Philadelphia in terms of size or influence. So it isn't symbolic. So that's also one of the unique things about the fall of Washington or the burning of Washington during this war is that, yeah, it's the capital.
But it's more symbolic than it is practical.
Yeah. And so we can talk a little bit about that, but obviously it's important. And where this ties back to our theme, and so we'll get into that here. We'll take a break here in a moment, then we'll get into the episode proper, is that the actual events of I want to say the sacking of Washington. It's not a temple, but the actual capture and siege, well, or the burning of Washington, has this historical weather intervention event. And we'll talk a little bit about that and when we get into that. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and pick up the story of, again, our theme here of weather/hurricane impact. In this case, we're in the War of 1812, and we've settled in the events that happened in the city of Washington in 1814. So we'll be right back after this small break. Alexis and Don here, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to actually talk about the technology that we're using to bring you the podcast. We're going to talk about Buzzsprout, which is where we host A Fork in Time. Now, you may get our podcast via a number of the other podcatchers, the other ways that podcasts are syndicated. So you might be listening on Apple Podcasts, you might be listening on Google Podcasts, you might be listening on Stitcher. But Alexis, where do we post the podcast at?
On Buzzsprout.
On Buzzsprout. When we started A Fork in Time, I got to be honest with you, I guess I'd read a few things. I was familiar with a couple of different podcast hosting sites because I'd heard their names being a podcast listener, but I had no idea what was really going to be involved with setting up a podcast. And I can tell you, it's actually pretty easy. Wouldn't you agree, Alexis?
Yes.
And the reason it's pretty easy that Buzzsprout's there to help you through every part of the process. And so what Buzzsprout is they're not just a hosting service, but they give you suggestions, and they're a platform that really helps podcasts of any size be able to get their word out. In fact, so much so that over 100,000 podcasts actually call Buzzsprout home.
Yep.
And so what we have for our listeners is an opportunity to help support the podcast and also utilize Buzzsprout services. So all you have to do is follow the link in the show notes. And if you do, because you're looking to start a podcast, they'll walk you through, believe me, they'll walk you through very easily on the website what you need to do. And if you choose to move forward there, we actually get a benefit from that. So I think I would call that, what's the word that we use for that, Alexis?
Win-win?
Win-win is the word that we use for that. And again, some of the things that I've already mentioned is we use Buzzsprout. We find it very easy to use. Uploading an episode each week, I think, is
super simple, and they even send you stats every week, which get a little addicting to look at.
I agree with that. In fact, that's another interesting thing that I didn't even, I guess, fully realize as we were starting, that immediately we'd be able to start seeing stats, not only about how many downloads, how many listens, but where in the world people are listening, all of that kind of thing. So it's not just a place to host a podcast. It's really the full support that's there. There's other affiliations that they have that allow either a novice podcaster or an experienced podcaster to get the podcast up and growing. So we don't consider anyone starting a podcast to be a competitor because we're all in this space together. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast, what would you recommend our listeners do, Lex?
Go to Buzzsprout. It's a good starting point.
I would agree. And so all you need to do is follow the link in our show notes and go there and you'll see what's available for you. So we'd encourage you to do that. So Buzzsprout, it's the home of A Fork in Time, and it could be home of your podcast as well. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don along with Alexis today. We're in the same room looking at each other recording. We don't get to do that all the time, so we're happy to be doing that today. As we talked about in episode 2 of our series on historical weather impacts, particularly hurricanes. In this case, we are dealing with the impact and the what-ifs of history. Back to the War of 1812, specifically the events of 1814 and the burning and the siege of the city of Washington. Real quick background on the War of 1812. What are some of the causal factors for this, Lex?
The biggest cause and impact, or the cause of the war, was impressment by the British Navy of citizens of what is now the United States back into service for the Royal Navy. We're not that far removed from the independence of the United States as a new country. Of course, that happens with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, so we're only 40-ish years or so removed from that. And so I think, and how it was described to me when I was in school was, if you've been living in this new country but you've lived in Britain for an extended period of time, you still have this thing called an accent. And so I think what was happening a lot is these people who sounded British but were actually American were being pressed back into service to serve in the British Navy and the British Army, and the new country of America wasn't taking too kindly to that.
Yeah, and of course the other backdrop here is the continental powers that are at war are the same continental powers that always seem to be at war, which are in this case Great Britain being part of that, but also France. And of course, remembering that France and the United States had this special affinity that goes back to the American Revolution and then the subsequent French Revolution. So this is Napoleonic France. And so Great Britain is at war along with other European powers against the forces of Napoleonic France. And so for many inside of the British Empire, They wouldn't call this the War of 1812. They just think of this as being part of the North American extension of the Napoleonic Wars. And the United States, Alexis already hit upon one of the major things, which was the impressment issue. But the other thing was, in Britain's effort to defeat France, they had instituted a naval blockade. And this was particularly harmful to American trade and commerce. And so by the time James Madison is president in 1812, and this is going on, there's the issue of the impressment. So there's an honor issue that's going on here. There's also a political affinity between the United States and France. Remember, the United States has grown tremendously in 1803 because Napoleon needs money.
He sold this vast swath of land.
Yeah, he has land, we got money, we need territory, and put all that together. And so, again, that's part of the connection that exists between the United States and France. Also, British pushing back to some degree on some of what happened there, what was proper territory, etc. Britain still is in Canada, so there's still that element that's going on. But so there's a political element to this. There's an honor element to it. There's also an economic element
yep.
because of the blockade. And so about now one generation removed from gaining its independence, the United States and Great Britain are back at war. And for the most part, I think the other reason why this is not covered as much as a military history for those of us that were born in the United States and studied here is there's not as much to tell about this. It was sporadic. It's a strange sort of war for me to actually be candid, to get my head around when I try to think it through, because I want wars to have nice little defined lines of battle and they controlled this and they controlled that. That's not the sense that I always have about the war.
I can name one battle of this war. That's it.
And what battle is that?
Battle of New Orleans. And that's mainly because of where I think I live.
Yeah, and by the way, the Battle of New Orleans actually took place after the conclusion of the peace, before the word got out. So the events that we're talking about here are actually in August of 1814. And the decision's been made by British forces to go and actually lay siege, attack, and burn the capital of Washington. Primarily, they're coming up from Baltimore and gathering other forces as well. If you're familiar with the geography, Baltimore and D.C. and Washington, D.C. are not that far apart. So it's at most a couple of days march for British military forces to come up and do that. And part of what's happened is there's been a United States attack into Canada where some things were destroyed. And so this is also seeking some retribution back on the city of Washington. So British forces come to Washington, D.C., and what do, Lex?
They start burning.
Yeah. They are not really opposed in any great way by military force.
Right.
And so they arrive, they do start setting fire to buildings, they start occupying things, the Treasury building. You mentioned the whole incident about the White House and fleeing with the possessions there. Dolly Madison, probably she's known for that as much as anything in history. All of that happens, but as it ends up, the British do not end up occupying D.C., and in fact, they aren't as successful with burning all of the city.
Right.
Why?
Some rain starts.
Yeah. So this is sometimes referred to as, what are some of the terms that are used to describe this particular little bit of weather?
The storm that saved Washington is the moniker that kept coming up when I was doing my research.
Yeah. So this is sometimes this event in history. It's not really the Battle of Washington. It's sometimes referred to as the burning of Washington. Yeah. And so just to put it in perspective, British forces under Major General Robert Ross, they set fire to multiple buildings, what was called the Presidential Mansion, then the White House. In fact, what I was always told, the reason it's white after this is they sort of painted it to cover the
scorch marks.
The scorch marks and things like that. The relatively new Capitol building and some of the other new, they're all new. Treasury building that's there. President Madison, military officials, the government flee the city in the wake of the battle that happens right before this, which is the Battle of Bladensburg. And they eventually end up in rural Maryland, which jokingly is called the United States Capitol for a day, this small little city in Montgomery County, Maryland. where they spent there. So less than a day after the attack began, the city is being burned. A very, very, very noticeable weather event happens. Historians argue that given the time of year, it probably could have been a hurricane or the remnants of a hurricane. Sometimes you will hear reference to tornado because what was spawned inside of it was a tornado. But the weather became so fierce that the British troops that were attempting to burn the city, to occupy the city, are driven away not by American forces because those have basically fled the city. What are they driven away by?
Rain.
They're driven away by rain.
And wind.
Yeah. In my head, I have, this is an insight, maybe those of you who listen into I have Forrest Gump in my head, a little bit of stinging rain that's happening here. But it's actually the rain event that does two primary things. It saves many of the structures in the Capitol because the rain puts out the fires or makes it difficult to set the fires. And then eventually the occupation of Washington only lasts for about 26 hours, a little more than a day, because the British forces decide enough of this rain stuff. We're going to go back to our ships and go back to the places where we can be dry. And there wasn't really much point for coming here other than to burn it. And we can't burn the town because the town's all wet. And so we go from there. So the historical what if we're going to talk about today is what would have happened if this hurricane had not come. So if there had not been the weather event that saved the destruction of Washington. Well, the first logical what if is Washington would have been destroyed.
Yes.
So, I mean, that seems like an obvious thing to say, well, of course, if it weren't saved, it would have been destroyed. That's a what if, but that's like what if level 0, perhaps. But I think it's important in the sense that, again, it was not the long-standing historical capital of an old-standing nation. It's a new nation with an artificially created capital. So, one of the first things that pops into my mind is, today, if it had been destroyed, assuming there still would have been an American victory and eventually the war would have come to an end without the loss of America's independence, which I don't think was really, in my mind, ever fully in question here.
Right.
Would we even be talking about Washington, D.C. as the capital today if it were totally destroyed and you had to totally rebuild it from scratch? And what's there? Any thoughts on that?
I think you're right. We've only had Washington, D.C. as a capital for 40 years, roughly. So I think if Washington is burned, I think it's just let's move and go somewhere else. We have plenty of options here. So, we could be sitting in the United States today talking about Philadelphia as the capital, New York as the capital. There were several other options if Washington suddenly is taken off the map. Let's use those terms.
Yeah. So for example, just one of the what ifs, it's a small thing, but when we use this euphemism where we use a nation's capital to describe their government. So, news out of London today, news out of Washington today, news out of Moscow today. We may not be saying news out of Washington. We may be talking, as you said, about Philadelphia or New York or some other place. May have decided they wanted some place that was more defendable. An argument can be made there because, again, it's kind
of in a marsh.
Yeah, there's a reason that Maryland, and primarily Maryland, gave up this land. It was not prime land. The argument can also be made, part of the reason it was given up, it was relatively close to the first president's home. But let's make it convenient for George to, when we build the new Capitol and fully move, although I guess technically he never, actually, I realize I don't know that. He never occupied it. But this idea of, something that would be close there and, again, situated to that long line of Virginians who would be in the White House, something there, its location was important. But I think one of the just interesting what-ifs is it may have just been the end of Washington, D.C. as a capital, this concept of having this separate federal district capital thing, which already had some folks who weren't necessarily nuts about it. So if you have the full destruction of the city where it's not, and there was a need to rebuild it, to some degree. But if you we're gonna have to start over from scratch. Why do we even bother starting over from scratch? We have a heritage that goes back to where the First Continental Congress set in Philadelphia, the early administration under President Washington's in New York. So why do we even go back to this? So one of the it may be again it's a level zero what if, but what if there the result could have been there's not a
There's not a Washington D.C.
there's not a Washington D.C. at least not in the way that we know it, or it would have been rethought. In fact, there was a move that actually happened at that time of let's don't rebuild it, let's relocate the capital. So that's I guess the first level again. That's a level zero what if. But let's talk about the more practical thing of during the war itself, because again, I think Congress stayed away for almost 4 weeks, like 3.5 weeks, but the President Madison and other officials were back within a matter of days. So let's imagine the scenario where there's no hurricane, there's no storm, the city really is
gone
to the point that it really can't be easily occupied or it can't be a seat of government. So what difference does that potentially have on what's going on with the war and maybe what's going on just moving forward from there in the historical events of that time?
Yeah, so again, we were talking a little bit off podcast. It's like, okay, if Washington is gone and you're having to figure things out, it was like, well, in my head, the logical thing is go to Philadelphia. Well, the problem with going to Philadelphia is you have to pass through this other city to get to Philadelphia called Baltimore. And there's a big army occupying Baltimore right now that just burned Washington, D.C. So you have this instance where the executive branch of the government ends up in backwoods Maryland and rural Maryland, and is having to kind of figure things out. So I think if you have no Washington and you can't get to Philadelphia because there's Baltimore in the way, you're having this executive branch trying to form a new government in the middle of nowhere and trying to stage a war in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, there's a prestige thing, if nothing else, there to be that your capital has been lost.
Right.
Whether it's your new capital that really doesn't have much, and I think I didn't even go looking for it. What did actually Washington D.C. look like in 1814? It certainly doesn't look anything like we think of it today. You look and go, oh, that's it. There's a couple of buildings and the grand monuments don't exist there. The other things that are there, it's a much smaller territory. But there is something symbolic about losing the capital in the symbolic sense. But there's also something practical about, the U.S. government is now on the
run.
On the run. Does it settle someplace?
Eventually.
Sure. It may settle someplace not that far away for a more enduring period of time. But just the symbolic nature of having lost the capital and being disrupted, does that change the way that the war is prosecuted? To me, the interesting thing there is for a lot of people, even a lot of British citizens were outraged by what was done to the D.C. The justification was we had burnt provincial capital up in York, I guess it was. Yeah. This was sort of retaliation back for that. But for a lot of folks, and this was already towards the end of the war, the Napoleonic phase of this is winding down. Sort of ironically, the near destruction of the city, or the attempt to burn it, was a catalyst towards ending the war.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think if it actually had succeeded, would there have been more outrage or would there have been less outrage? I don't know where I fall on that, but it just could have been different.
Yeah, no, I think that is really interesting to think about. I mean, the war is basically over at this point, so you do have a lot of British citizens going, you overreacted to this. This was too much. So I tend to probably lean towards the side of it. There would have been more outrage. Like, what were you doing? No, this was completely the wrong reaction to this, and it would have precipitated maybe a quicker end to the War of 1812.
Yeah, I think one of the things that definitely jumps to my mind there is, I think very likely because it was sort of prescribed in the Constitution there was going to be this neutral capital territory. That's how it came to be. I tend to hold the position they would not have moved the capital because there was an effort to move it that it wasn't successful. And I don't think even the more complete destruction, in fact, in some ways I think it would have been symbolic of we're definitely going to rebuild it, we're going to come back. But I think you may have seen a different design or layout or concept of the idea of, I know a lot of the circles and the other things that are there in D.C. today are the whole concept of this idea of that being more militarily defensible, and all I've seen the circles and the hub spoke
Yeah.
layout being long Lafont, I guess, is the designer, sort of being the idea of making it more defendable. But I think you might have seen a very different way that the reconstructed Capitol may have been laid out. So okay, we're going to be able to defend this better in the future. We're not going to build these things as far apart. In my mind, you can speak to this better than I can, but how much distance is there between like the House of Parliament and, well, there's all kinds of palaces, I guess, in London, so this is probably a poor example I'm doing here on the fly, but how concentrated is the British government in the City of London?
Very, very concentrated. The Palace of Westminster, St. James's, which is actually not to chase a rabbit too far, but actually the government is actually called the Court of St. James. Buckingham Palace, which is the Queen's residence in London, they are all very close together, so it's very easy to kind of centralize that power, for sure.
Yeah. So imagine a scenario, again, this is just me spitballing here, so to speak, but imagine a scenario instead of building a very distinct, separate Capitol building, separate from what was called the Presidential Mansion at then, which is at the end of this. You can see them from each other along Pennsylvania Avenue. But imagine that there's a desire to build more of a compound type of approach where the presidential executive offices are in the same building or a building that's directly adjacent to where Congress is. The Supreme Court was not even out in its own separate place at this point. The Supreme Court was meeting, as it did for a good portion of time, in
the Capitol building.
Capitol building, subterranean rooms in the Capitol building in some instances. So imagine a scenario where the United States Capitol, the actual seat of government today, still might have the three branches that we think of now, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, but they're all in one building or this little more of a cluster of buildings, maybe around where Capitol Hill exists today. The presidential residence may have been near there, but the presidential residence is not the seat of the executive. It's somehow, tied back together. Again, if you have the chance to redo this, because you have to redo this, and it doesn't become symbolic that it's survived and you're going to continue to do that, you may end up with a different look and feel. And I'm always struck by, designers will tell you this, that yes, it's about form, but function often follows form. And so, if you'd had a situation where the presidential executive offices and the congressional offices were in the same building or these directly adjacent buildings, how does that play out just, historically in political battles internal over time, that kind of thing. Just something to think about. Other thoughts about what might be different if you don't have the saving grace of a hurricane?
Something that kind of sticks in my head, and we kind of touched on this previously, is the District of Columbia, D.C., Washington, D.C., kind of exists in this weird between state. It's not a state. It's still to this day not a state. We've actually had conversations in recent years about the fact that it kind of exists in this weird halfway state. It's not a state. It's not really a city. It's kind of this between thing. So if you have the British completely decimating Washington, D.C., even though in the Constitution there was this specification for this, piece of land that doesn't necessarily fall in the same lines, does it become this situation where the government is like, this was a weird idea we had, and I don't know if it's really, really working. Do you have this move and this push to make a city like Philadelphia or like New York just the capital of the country, in addition to being the capital of the state? Philadelphia, the capital of Pennsylvania. New York is actually not the capital of New York, it's Albany, but New York could become the capital of the country, because it's kind of like, this whole concept with Washington, D.C. is super weird. Let's just start over and not have Washington, D.C.
And I think technically isn't Harrisburg the capital of Pennsylvania?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
So
it's the whole thing where the biggest city is not the capital, which happens a lot.
Yeah. Which is why, though, we are arguing that Houston should be the capital of Texas. But that's neither here nor there. It's not. But I think you raise an interesting point there, which is this concept of it was so new, and so could it, if there's more involved with doing that, could it have changed something? And where I go there is assuming that the government had to relocate for a longer period of time to someplace. you get the way that I think of this in some way, it's inertia. It's this bodies at rest tend to remain at rest, bodies that tend to be in motion. If the government of the United States had functionally moved to, even though the war was over, but it had functionally moved, let's say, back to New York or to Philadelphia or to someplace in Virginia. Again, it could have gone a number of different places, Baltimore maybe even. So the British are gone.
Let's go there.
We'll go nearby. It's close. It's Baltimore. If it functionally goes there for a period of time,
does it just stay?
Does it just stay? And is there more of that effort again to keep it there? Because, well, why go to the expense? Why go to the trouble? Why go to the hassle? Or, again, just as things tend to happen over a period of time, we intend to go back as soon as we get the funding done and as soon as it gets built. And then, not just months go by, but years go by. And eventually, again, another movement comes along and changes that. So, again, to me, as we've been going down this one, this I think is maybe, I don't know if it's the least interesting of sort of the four topics that we'll hit in this area, but if you turn and look at it, it sounds like it's a big deal that, this hurricane, tornado, massive rainstorm, the storm that saved Washington is true. It did. It saved. And the difference that made in the big picture was
not big.
Maybe not as big as you think that it is, because the fall of Washington would not have been the same of if Washington fell in 1914 as a result of the war, a war that didn't, but the War of 1912,
right,
where it had been the capital for 100 plus years, and whatever the case might be. Again, it's how D.C. is perceived, how Washington D.C. is perceived at that time that I think makes it less consequential.
Yeah, I think we have the benefit now of looking at a title like The Storm That Saved Washington and go, oh, but it's because we're living in 2020. So we've lived with the capital of the United States being Washington, D.C. for 300 and, I can't do math real quickly in my head, but 300 and something years, not 40.
Yeah, a little over 200. But being, again, there were other cities that were much larger, that were much more influential during the period of time. An argument was being made that New York should be the capital, that Philadelphia should be the capital. Somebody was probably making an argument for Boston. Somebody else was making an argument for something else.
Yeah.
And even by the time, this is the other interesting thing. If you were to relocate the capital, we talked a little bit before about what happened in 1803. Louisiana Purchase. The territory of the United States, even during the American not the American Civil War, certainly by the American Civil War, during the American Revolutionary War, was already moving and expanding westward.
Yep.
And if you look back to particularly a map of the United States today, the thing that strikes you about the capital is it's really, 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 really far
east.
It resides on the eastern seaboard of the United States. It's, even by plane flights today, several hours removed from the westernmost parts of the continental United States. So if you're in 1814, 15, you're the conclusion of the war, during that particular period of time, now you're saying, okay, our capital's been destroyed. What are we going to do about that? Are we going to rebuild it? You still might have had a scenario where, because it was sort of mandated, there was going to be this non-state federal jurisdiction. But somebody may have been saying, we're already moving further west. So should we look for something out Pittsburghish way?
Yeah.
Should we look for something that's more out into the Ohio, what we think of as being modern Ohio today? Should we look for something that is more central to where we're eventually going here?
Yeah, and that actually, what popped in my head just now is that's very similar to Australia. When you think of Australia, of course you have the big city Sydney on the east coast, but the actual capital of Australia is Canberra, and the reason it's picked is because it's pretty close to the exact center of the country. So when they were picking that capital, it was like, let's go in the middle. Let's not go on either one extreme. So I think that's not a far cry to be like, hey, we're already going westward, and our capital has been destroyed. Let's move the capital a little more towards the center.
Well, and the other thing that was even already starting to happen, I mentioned earlier about the influence of Virginia as an early state. So many of the first presidents there's this long line of...
Yeah, the Virginia dynasty?
Yeah. But there already was a change that was happening in the American populace. Again, the Louisiana Purchase had been acquired, so we know we're expanding west. We bought the land. Now, how that's going to play out in terms of, is it going to be states? Is it going to be territories? All of that is obviously still up, although we had grown in the number of states. We're beginning the major process of growing the number of states, around this particular period of time here. I do think it's not as far down the what if to imagine if you're starting over from absolute scratch, which is, again, this is the historical what if. You are starting over from scratch because there's no storm.
There is no storm.
Right, that saves the burning and the further destruction and drives the British out to not do more. Part of the reason they don't burn more, they're not there long enough to burn more.
They just cut and run.
They cut and run, and they don't burn more because they can't get stuff to catch fire because it's all wet and the wind. But if you imagine how that may have played out with the relocation of the capital, that is now the type of thing that is maybe not consequential, but maybe it is more consequential. I mean, one of the things that even happens carrying down to modern United States politics is that if you are in the far west of the United States, if you're in the south of the United States, you look towards, when you use the term Washington, which is not always used in a positive sense, you do identify it as being somewhat by its location. It's removed from where you are, and for parts of the U.S., it's very far removed from where you are. It's a much greater distance. So I think that's one of the interesting ways that could play out is if you have a more centralized or located location, it may be different.
You might actually just heard our unofficial mascot, Madison, making some noise in the background. She was probably barking at a twig on the street, but...
And again, she was just quickly, we don't mind, we like the idea of sort of sharing things up. She was a rescued animal.
Rescue dog, and she was actually rescued on July the 4th. So I made the decision to, if I'm rescuing her on Independence Day, I should give her a patriotic name. So she's named after Dolly Madison.
Yeah, so that's the connection back to the episode. I'm real tempted here. I'm not sure that I'm going to do this because I found other images that will make a great thing that's there. But this may be a 2-image thing on the podcast, or maybe we're at the point now where she actually needs her picture and her page on the podcast.
There we go.
As the official
mascot of A Fork in Time.
Exactly, she's the mascot of A Fork in Time. So we may do that. Lex, I really can't think of any other big things here. Can you?
No, I mean, this is kind of those ones, like, yes, if Washington, D.C. is completely destroyed, we might be talking about, the capital of the U.S. being Pennsylvania, being New York. But, I mean, that wouldn't have changed foreign policy. That wouldn't have changed a lot of things in terms of how America ultimately functioned as a country. So I think it's one of those things that sounds like a big deal when you're reading it in the headline or reading it on paper, but then when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's like, it could have happened, it could have not happened.
Yeah. The one thing I will say about this, and this just really struck me, it's related but it's unrelated, is if an existing city prior to the American Revolution had become the capital, New York, for example. New York was the capital, so that's actually probably a better example. New York and Philadelphia are probably the two best examples because they served functionally as the capital to some degree. They already had, and we do have famous American symbolic landmarks there. For example, in Philadelphia, there's Independence Hall. In New York, there's the area that's near Wall Street, which is where the Federal District was, so you can see where federal offices took place. But what I would argue is you would probably have more post-revolutionary American monuments or symbolic structures that exist in Philadelphia or New York or wherever that capital would have been than you do today. But what was unique about Washington, D.C. is sort of this fresh canvas, and the way it was designed is that when we think of Washington, D.C., at least for me, I think of the Capitol building. I think of, obviously, the White House. I think of the Washington Monument. I think of the National Mall. I think of the various memorials, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. I think of all these things that are, I guess the word that's running through my head is artificial, in the sense that they were not organic to the city that already existed. They were built the way they were, where they were, how they were, because we were building a national capital.
Yeah, it's almost like Washington, D.C. is this museum that is a city.
I think that's a good way to think about it. Or the other weird thing that ran into my head here. It's we talk about a Disney park, which is sort of yes, it looks like reality, but it's this pseudo
Yeah.
reality. There's an element to, and again, Madison is now making herself very well known in the background. There's this pseudo reality to Washington D.C. that because it's an artificially created capital city, that's really what it is. It didn't organically
Yeah.
really exist as a city before. It has a unique character to it. And so again, one of the changes would be the capital, if it's not Washington, is not quite the same way that we think about a capital today. For example, in Philadelphia, there is like a large area where near Independence Hall, there's a public square area, as I recall. Do you have a Lincoln Memorial in that?
Nope.
Do you have a Washington Memorial in that? Do you have a large, tall obelisk in the? It would look
Different.
different. So I guess the fair thing to say there, if there's no storm that saved Washington, it would look different. End of story.
Yeah. Period.
End of story. End of story. But I do think it is relevant. Is that it's probably not as much historically politically different. It's
symbolic.
It's symbolically and physically different is probably the most likely thing that we get. So this is one of those cases where is history impacted? Yes. Is the what if an interesting thing to think about? But if you're going to rate the significance of the what if on a scale of 1 to 10,
We're at like a 1.5.
yeah, maybe a 2 or a 3. If you think about the fact that it could have led to the relocation of the capital, then it actually carries, I think, a little bit further. In fact, to me, I just am struck now thinking about what we talked about in the last episode about the impact might not be so much where the impact was.
Yep.
The impact is not necessarily, okay, how does Washington, D.C. look different? But if you end up relocating the capital, is the impact someplace else? Is Philadelphia
Yeah.
a very different city today? Or if it returns to New York, is New York a very different city today where it's not just the financial capital, but it's also the
Judicial capital.
and the political
Legislative,
capital,
yeah.
and all the things that go with that, because we know later, even early on in history there, but later in history, that becomes some of the tension that exists in terms of, what New York's role is going to be. And I will say this, and thought we were done, again, a thought keeps popping into my head, is this idea of, I think we used the term organic. I don't know if that was actually on podcast or off talking about, if the capital had been a city that had already organically grown versus sort of artificially had been created, is that if you introduce the element of being the capital into an organic situation,
That already exists.
do you change the organism?
Possibly.
Is New York, for example, different in some way, more philosophically, not just physically? Oh yeah, there would have been this monument, and for example, again, what runs into my mind, imagine that what we think of as being Central Park today. Imagine if that's actually where eventually where all of the federal buildings and the Capitol.
That's a weird image in my head, guys.
So it starts popping up, or maybe I said, maybe there isn't an obelisk, or maybe there are monuments like the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument. They're just in modern day, what we think of as being modern day Central Park, which is now Federal Park, or Monument Square, or because I think if I remember back to the evolution of the city of New York, there had been sort of the layout for that grand Central Park already by the time that we're here in the early 19th century. So you could have had this land that was already sort of set aside that could have then been repurposed for being the federal, or you may have just moved that federal district into the middle of the city of New York. So I thought we were done, but ideas keep spinning here. The thing that jumped into my mind is, think about how the Vatican City sits inside of Rome. Mm-hmm. Now imagine the federal United States Capitol
sitting inside of New York. Not a far cry.
Yeah, that to me is that may be the most interesting thought we've come across here, and it took 45 minutes into the recording of the episode to think about that. But again, does it have a huge significance? Probably not. But you change a small thing there, just the symbolic nature, even back to something we did in another episode, the attacks of 9/11.
Right.
Now they're not focused across, again, let's just assume that we've created the world that I've just described, where the capital relocates to New York for practical reasons and other reasons, and we end up having some variant of Central Park is federalized in one way, shape, form, or fashion. So now imagine everything else sort of in American history carries out. That's just the different thing. There is no separate D.C., where's the military housed? Is there a Pentagon? Probably.
And do we have these things called the World Trade Centers also in New York?
Yeah, and so under that scenario, but let's say we do. Let's say we have the World Trade Centers, and let's say the Pentagon sits on the Meadowlands Stadium over in New Jersey, just similar to how it sits over in Arlington. There would have been a need for a big office building during World War II. They just would have put it in New Jersey. Instead of talking about going to Arlington, we'd be talking about going to Newark. But under that scenario, imagine that the attacks of 9/11 happened. Now it's a much more concentrated set of targets that have both, again, financial significance. We talked about this, but also have political significance. Those are now more easily combined into one target. That does change things maybe a little bit. Maybe it takes 200 years for that to materialize, or in some other way, or any other place when we would have felt concerned about what was going on. Actually, again, another thing that pops in my head, I immediately talk about the Civil War. One of the things we do talk a lot about. Much of the Civil War was fought everywhere, but a lot of it was fought in the territories of Northern Virginia, Southern Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Around, one of the most interesting things about the American Civil War is that the federal capital remaining in Washington, the Confederate capital being in Richmond, are very close to each other. That would not necessarily have played out the same way, perhaps, if you have a New York capital. I can't help but think when I think about the American Civil War, the famous thing of when Robert E. Lee is offered the command of Union forces. He's living at his wife's mansion across the Potomac, which now sits in Arlington National Cemetery, the Lee Custis Mansion that's there. He's there.
Yep.
To have to go and accept that invitation from Lincoln, he has to go to New York. That's a very different mindset about how far you're going physically and how far you're going philosophically when you do that. Just a thought. Today you can see the Lee Custis Mansion, you can see Arlington National Cemetery from D.C.
Yep. Oh, yeah. That was one of the things that struck me when we went, is how everything is so close together.
Right. So, but you have a different scenario there. Just, again, that's the late thing that crossed my mind as we're sort of closing things out. Just, again, practically, probably not. Symbolically, probably, yes. All right. Anything else?
I think we pretty much covered it.
All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed the second installment of the 4-part series here about weather's impact on history, again, particularly hurricanes. So we have been to 1588. We've now been to 1814. Alexis will not let me tell you where we're going. We've covered this already. So we are...
But I will say that we have now covered both instances where the storm was not the story.
Okay, that's true. This is an instance where, in the case of the Armada, the Spanish invasion is obviously the story. In the case of the burning of Washington, what goes on there, the attempts in 1814, the storm
was an anecdote.
Right, and an influencing factor. In the last two, it's going to be different, though, right?
In the last two, the storm is the story.
Okay, so I think that's a good way to tease what will be episode 3 here. We said we're moving chronologically, so we know we're not going back before 1814. We're going
forward, but we're not going forward very far.
Okay, we're not going forward very far in history. So again, to pull the curtain back a little bit, we're recording these episodes in a fairly short window of time. You're getting them spaced out by a week.
Yeah.
You have to wait a week before the next episode, and you can be thinking about that for a week. Let's just suffice to say it's not going to be as long a period of time for us.
And the next one has significance to both me and my dad.
Okay, yeah. We talked about how these things pull back together. So once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time today. Not going to spend as much time as we normally do closing out the show, except to say that we do appreciate you joining us. We welcome you visiting our website. That's www.a forkintimepodcast.com. What are the two things that are important there, Lex?
A and podcast.
Yeah, you won't get to the right place if you don't go there. You can check out the links in the show notes as well. Obviously, we talk about places to give us feedback, posting us on social media, links to our Patreon page, all the different ways that you can support the podcast, both financially and through non-financial support. But the most important support that you provide us is giving us the gift of your time and attention. So what do we like to say about that, Lex?
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you. So once again, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope that you'll come back and you're excited about hearing installment 3.
Yep.
And we'll have that for you on the next episode of A Fork in Time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.